I have visited North Korea several times since the late 90s, but as with all foreign visitors, my movements have been restricted and the people I've been able to see have been limited, so I cannot possibly offer the kind of inside story that a person who really is from there can say. I will try to keep my remarks brief. I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions for Ms. Lee. And I wanted to take this opportunity to give some sort of context and some background to the North Korean situation and the situation on the Korean Peninsula where we are now. And as I am a historian, even though I promise to talk a bit about my ideas for what may happen, I will talk mostly about the past because I think it's important to put North Korea into historical context to understand where we might be going today. Originally, this event today was titled Prospects for Unification, and I do hope we have some time to talk about unification. I think unification is important. Our dream is unification, as the Koreans say, 우리 소원은 통일. But dreams have to be tempered by reality and not determined by wishful thinking, however important those dreams may be. So it's it's an extraordinary story we've just heard. The sacrifices, the lengths that people will go to leave North Korea for leaving the country is a crime, with facing severe punishment if you're caught. And so we can see for a variety of reasons, poverty, the human rights problems, political oppression and so on, people will take these risks to leave the country, risks not only to themselves, but to their families. I actually visited Wonsan and Hamhung in my last visit to North Korea 2012. So this is the image we normally see of North Korea, this very belligerent, militaristic state launching missiles. They just had a missile launch a couple of weeks ago. In September of last year, they had their second nuclear test, which was widely condemned by much of the international community and faced UN sanctions. This was the second nuclear test in the year. And yet, North Korea continues to go forward with more testing and will be, as people have come to see, a real challenge for the current U.S. administration as it has been for administrations before. On the other hand, North Korea, or the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, has talked about the need for improving the economy, which is still in extremely bad shape, although, as I'll say in a moment, perhaps doing a little bit better than before, to improve people's standards of living, and to give more autonomy to local industries and so on. But what's really happening, and we've seen a glimpse of that from Ms. Lee's testimony, what really seems to have been happening over the last 10 to 15 years in North Korea is a kind of marketization from below. It is not so much that the state is reforming the economy the way that China did in the late 70s and 80s, but ordinary people, out of necessity, even desperation, are turning to market forces which are either illegal or semi-legal. The government goes back and forth on how much latitude to give people engaged in the market. But that's how most people now seem to get what they need to survive, through the black market, or through the, not necessarily black market, let's call it the gray market, the unofficial market, or even official markets, because markets have also been allowed to some extent to flourish in North Korea. Kim Jong-un talked in the 7th Korean Workers' Party Congress in May, which was a very big event, first one since 1980, about the need to pursue what he called the policy of Pyeongjin, and that is an important term to keep in mind. Pyeongjin means both military and economic development at the same time. Essentially, the Pyeongjin policy of Kim Jong-un has meant to pursue nuclear weapons development and economic development. But what we have in North Korea, from my experience, from what I read and what I understand, is an economy that is developing, and it's certainly in much better condition than it was in the 1990s or even the early 2000s when Ms. Lee left. But the gap between Pyongyang and the countryside, the gap between the rich and the poor, is growing enormously. You have fantastic new construction in Pyongyang, these skyscrapers on the top that were built in 2012. This area in Pyongyang has gotten the nickname Pyonghattan for its kind of Manhattan-esque skyline of this new water park. But in the countryside, conditions are still, in most of the small cities, conditions are still very poor. There's a severe energy shortage. There's lack of technology, and people's lives are quite difficult. Now, let me go into briefly over the history. How did North Korea come to be this way, and how is North Korea different from basically every other communist state that has come to be in the 20th century? And this is important to remember because when people say, well, North Korea is just going to collapse like East Germany or the Soviet Union, we shouldn't be so sure, because despite all the contradictions and problems, North Korea is and has been from almost the beginning a very unique kind of political system and unique kind of country, for better and for worse. It was founded in the late 1940s after the liberation of Korea from Japanese colonial rule. The first leader was Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the current leader. We see him above as a guerrilla fighter in the 1930s, fighting the Japanese in Manchuria, and then introduced in October of 1945 by Soviet soldiers when Korea was liberated, before the Democratic People's Republic, or North Korea, was established as a state in September of 1948, a couple of weeks after the Republic of Korea in the South was established. You'll notice at that time still there are taegukgi, for those of you familiar, the Korean flag, what is now the South Korean flag, behind Kim Il-sung before the North Korean flag was developed. Now, the other event, the event that was really formative for North Korea was the Korean War, but more particularly how the Korean War is officially remembered and commemorated and propagated in North Korea. And just very briefly, from the North Korean sort of official line, the Korean War was a war of aggression by the U.S. to colonize Korea, and a sign of the Americans' continuous aggression. And you see a photo of a bombing in the Korean War, a monument to the war, and then this mural that you'll see at the Sinchon Museum of War Atrocities, which alleges some 30,000 civilians killed by Americans. This has never been proven, but this is part of the lore, that is the mythology of North Korea, a vicious United States, but more fundamentally, the need for North Koreans to be in solidarity and unite against any kind of foreign aggression. So that's a sort of official mindset. Not everyone entirely subscribes to this view, but I think this is important to understand sort of where North Korea is coming from in the way that it's positioned in the world. Then during the Korean War, North Korea was able to rather successfully navigate the Sino-Soviet split, leaning toward China or toward the Soviet Union, benefiting from both. And this practice of sort of extracting or getting benefits from much more powerful countries, even countries with which they did not have necessarily at all times good relations, has been a consistent pattern in North Korea and continues to this day, I think, in a certain sense, as North Korea tries to both benefit from its relationship to China, but also attempt to gain what it can from the adversarial relationship that it has with the United States. So North Korea was quite unique in this way of all communist countries, being able to sort of navigate the very hostile relations between the Soviet Union and China. North Korea at the moment does not pursue very much improving relations with Russia, but one could see potentially that it could play a very similar game too between Russia and China today. So I can talk a bit about North Korea's dependence on China, but above all, from the 50s to the 60s and then consolidating the 70s, there were these ideas that sort of centered around independence, what's sometimes translated as self-reliance. This idea of representing this Cholima statue at Pyongyang of advancing forward technologically, making great sacrifices of the people to advance the country. The Cholima is this legendary East Asian horse that went 1,000 li, chol li, or 1,000 traditional miles in a day. Kim Il-sung, of course, with his statue there. There's a new statue I'll show in a moment, as the sort of central figure, the mythological leader. And then in the middle, this idea of national independence, self-reliance, juche, as they call it in North Korea, which sort of emerges in the 60s and then becomes what they call the guiding principle of politics. So what we have essentially is a very fiercely independent, autonomous drive toward not relying or not complying with any other foreign power. As Kim Il-sung said in his famous Juche speech, or became famous later in retrospect, we should not blindly copy the Soviet Union, but drill down to the essence of experience and follow that. But by the late 50s, early 60s, it was clear even to the other communist countries that something very strange and unusual and unique was going on, that this country wasn't about communism, and it wasn't about Marxism-Leninism. It was really about following the glorious leader, Kim Il-sung, and nationalism. And I think that it really goes a long way to explain how North Korea came to be what it is, and also how it survived the collapse of other communist countries from 1989 to 1991. North Korea had always been divergent, and in a way, although there was a tremendous economic cost in the collapse of the Soviet Union to North Korea, politically it was able to continue on, even through the terrible famine of the 1990s, based on this very powerful centralized leadership and also this sense of national purpose and centralization. For a while, and this might give us some hope, North Korea did reach out to the non-communist world in the 1970s, relating economically to capitalist countries, was active in the non-aligned movement of third world countries, even for some seen as a model of development. And then in 1972, North and South Korea had a declaration for peaceful unification. And you can see the evidence of North Korea even today, by the way. This is the tallest statue in Africa. It is in Senegal, and it was built by the same art group that built the Juche Tower. Although now, in the latest round of UN sanctions, this sculpture production has been specifically restricted or proscribed, so they're not able to do that. In other words, North Korea is very isolated, but it has had connections to the outside world, which shouldn't be forgotten. But in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, North Korea went through a tremendously difficult period. What the outside world described as a famine that killed at least several 100,000, if not 1 or 2 million people. It's severe food shortage, energy shortage, which was called the Arduous March, or March Through Distress, based on this sort of mythical event that Kim Il-sung went through in fighting the Japanese in the 1930s, and then exclaimed through propaganda. It was, anyone who lived through it anywhere in the country can say what a terrible time it was. Then, to skip forward, in 2012, the 100th anniversary of the birth of Kim Il-sung, North Korea launched a campaign to be what it called 강성대국, or powerful nation. Sometimes a strong and prosperous nation is how it translated, but really it meant, above all, a military powerful country, and secondarily, an economically powerful country. So it's important that for the regime, the priority is self-defense by nuclear weapons if necessary, and economic reform is secondary. In 2011, the ground was laid for the transfer to the third generation of Kim, and it's very interesting, and perhaps Ms. Lee can attest to this, how these sorts of political events are prefigured and propagated through songs and through poetry to let people know, kind of encode what's going on. The Suryong, Jangun, Daejang, the great leader, the general, and the 4-star general are code for Kim Il-sung, his son Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-il's son Kim Jong-un, respectively. And indeed, when I was there in 2011, these signs popped up all over Pyongyang and elsewhere, indicating that this succession was taking place. So the idea that the father-to-son succession was sort of unplanned or unprepared, I think, is wrong. I think that the leadership knew that they were going to do this generational transfer, and were trying to pave the ground for it. And many people, you could say, accepted it. Certainly, they didn't see any point in opposing it, as this fit in well with the kind of political culture that had developed in North Korea. And this, again, is something totally different from any other communist country that existed in the 20th century, or for that matter, China or other communist countries today. But it's really at the core of what North Korea is as a regime, a family regime centered on the ruling family of the Kim, through a line of male succession. So here we are at the Kim Jong-un in the Kim Jong-un era. I showed you the statue before of Kim Il-sung. A few years ago, that was replaced by a newer statue of Kim Il-sung and his son Kim Jong-il. So we now have the two standing side by side in the center of Pyongyang. Presumably someday, if this system continues, when Kim Jong-un is gone, there'll be three. I don't know when they're going to run out of room and stop putting statues up there. But so far, the system in place is one of highly centralized, family-centered leadership, in which one's connections to the central leader and his family are all important. And as a consequence, it is very difficult to counter that, to stage a coup or to create an alternative center of power. But as I looked at this, and I visited North Korea in 2012 when the regime of Kim Jong-un was really consolidating, and here we see him on the left at the May 2016 Korean Workers' Party conference. The one interesting difference from his appearances before was that he was wearing a Western-style suit. Whether that means he's a reformer, I don't know, but it is interesting. I should point out also, as many people have, that one of the reasons he looks the way he does is because, and perhaps one of the reasons he is in power is because of his resemblance to his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, who most people even today in North Korea still respect more than his father, Kim Jong-il. But reflecting on that, looking at this second generation and then third generation succession, I could not help but think of this old East Asian phrase, "복불과 3대," wealth does not go past three generations, whether it's Samsung or political leadership in North Korea. One wonders how long this kind of hereditary leadership can continue, and will this go on under Kim Jong-un, if so, for how long, and after Kim Jong-un, what will happen? I've talked about the past, getting us up to the present, and let me just give you a few reflections of the future. Well, so far under Kim Jong-un, we haven't seen any dramatic change in the system. There were hopes that he would be a more active reformer, but that does not appear to be the case. On the other hand, the economy, from Bank of Korea statistics and other outside observations, seems to be doing okay with slight growth. Certainly much better than it was 10 years ago, and far better than it was 15 years ago as the famine was winding down. And as I said, what we have in North Korea is a de facto market economy, really a marketization from the bottom up through entrepreneurs like Ms. Lee and others. Under the broad guidelines of government-sponsored goals. But what you have, in effect, is a kind of hybrid economy, a market economy, and some degree of state directions. Is North Korea's political system in trouble? There are different interpretations of this. The killing of Kim Jong-nam last week suggests to some that the regime is shaky. I'm not sure we can read it that way. There have been some high-profile defections. The number 2 man in the North Korean embassy in London defected last year. But in fact, the number of purges seems to be declining, even though some have gotten a lot of airplay since 2013. So my reading would be that, in fact, what we have been seeing is Kim Jong-un actually consolidating power rather than these purges being a sign of weakness. So despite these dramatic defections, so the speculation that Kim Jong-un's elite support was collapsing, which we saw in South Korean reports late last year, I think is certainly overblown. But what will happen? I mean, the short answer is nobody knows. I certainly don't know. It's hard to imagine that things could simply continue the way they are. I think it is also wrong to assume that nothing has changed. North Korea is changing, in many respects changing very quickly, but into what, we cannot yet say. What the leadership, what the media has tried to demonstrate in the last year or so, in recent months, particularly at the Seventh Party Congress in May, is that Kim Jong-un is in charge. Not only in charge, but the era of Kim Jong-un, the era characterized by his leadership, had truly arrived. This era is characterized by unprecedented demonstrations of military force, 2 nuclear tests last year, and numerous missile tests, in order to show his own power, Kim Jong-un's own power, I think, but also that North Korea can stand up against the world. At the same time, there are repeated statements that the economy has to be a priority, and I would think that Kim Jong-un himself understands, and he's indicated that he does, the urgent need to really move forward the economy. They have done some things, as I've said, particularly in Pyongyang and kind of area of consumer culture, but much more needs to be done to bring North Korea into anything resembling a modern economy. So the fate of Pyeongjin, which seems to be Kim Jong-un's signature term of military and economic development going on simultaneously, remains to be seen. Tensions with South Korea and the U.S. have been very high. The South Korean investments in the Kaesong Industrial Complex were shut down last year in North Korea. The communications between North Korea and the U.S. has been curtailed, although the talks may be beginning again soon. And the UN Security Council has passed ever more stringent sanctions resolutions on North Korea. So far, they have not deterred North Korea's missile and nuclear development, nor even shown real signs that they are affecting the economy. Maybe they will. The effects will take some time to arrive. But in the meantime, Kim Jong-un soldiers on, as he has for the last 5 years. Thank you.